For 3 days, the orphan foal had been following the cowboy across the unforgiving plains. He tried to ignore it. He tried to chase it away. But when he finally discovered why it chose him, he broke down in tears. The Dakota Badlands are a place that tests the soul. A brutal, beautiful landscape of cracked earth and ancient stone, where the sun beats down without mercy and the wind whispers stories of forgotten bones. It was not a place for the careless or the weak. Cole Younger was neither. He was traveling through this desolate expanse as a shortcut, a calculated risk to save a week's journey. With his giant stallion, Redemption, as his partner, he was confident. He had packed enough water for 2, enough food for a week, and a patience forged in the fires of his own past. But there was one thing he hadn't prepared for: a shadow. It had started 3 days ago, a mere flicker on the horizon, a tiny, dust-colored shape struggling to keep pace. Cole had initially dismissed it, assuming it was a coyote or a lost calf that would soon give up. But it didn't. By the second day, the shadow had a name: Trouble. It was a foal, impossibly small and heartbreakingly alone, its ribs showing faintly beneath a scruffy coat. It never got too close, maintaining a respectful distance of 100 yards. But it never, ever fell behind. Now, on the morning of the 3rd day, the game had changed. Cole awoke from a restless sleep to the soft sound of sniffing near his bedroll. He opened his eyes, and there it was. Not 100 yards away, but barely 10 feet from him, standing in the pale dawn light. The foal. It stood perfectly still, its large, dark eyes fixed on him with an unblinking, unnerving intensity. It wasn't threatening, it wasn't begging, it was waiting. Cole sat up, a wave of profound frustration washing over him. This was no longer a coincidence. This was a decision made by a creature that should have been cowering in fear, not seeking out the company of a man and a horse that could crush it without a thought. Go on, get out of here. Find your mother. He stood up and waved his arms aggressively. The foal flinched and stumbled back, but it didn't run. It simply retreated to a distance of 20 yards and resumed its silent, watchful vigil. Cole let out a heavy sigh, the sound swallowed by the immense silence of the plains. He looked at Redemption, who was watching the entire exchange with a calm, almost curious demeanor. The giant stallion seemed completely unbothered by their tiny follower, a fact that only deepened Cole's annoyance. His mind raced through the pragmatic, brutal logic of the wild. A lone foal was a death sentence. Without its mother's milk, without the protection of a herd, it was a walking meal for the predators that stalked these lands. And by following him, it was becoming his problem. It would slow him down, drain his precious water supply, and attract unwanted attention. His every instinct, honed by a lifetime of survival, told him to be ruthless, to ride hard and fast, and leave the foal to its inevitable fate. He broke camp with a grim, determined efficiency, ignoring the small shadow that watched his every move. He swung himself into Redemption's saddle, his jaw set. He would not look back. He would not feel pity. This was the law of the land. He urged Redemption into a steady trot, faster than his usual traveling pace. The sound of their powerful hoofbeats was soon joined by a frantic, stumbling patter. Cole refused to turn. He stared straight ahead at the shimmering horizon. But he could hear it. The sound of a tiny, desperate creature, fighting against exhaustion, fighting against the crushing loneliness of the plains. For the sole, inexplicable purpose of keeping up with a stranger who wanted nothing to do with it. The sun climbed higher in the sky, beating down on the man, the giant horse, and the persistent, tiny shadow that followed them. Cole's resolve was a hard line in the dust, but with every desperate footfall he heard behind him, that line was beginning to blur. The mystery of the foal was no longer just a nuisance. It was becoming a question that echoed in the silence of his own heart. Why him? By midday, the Badlands had transformed into a furnace. Heat shimmered off the cracked earth, distorting the horizon into a watery mirage. Cole's frustration, simmering for days, now hardened into a grim resolve. If the foal would not leave by choice, he would force it to. He would outrun it, outlast it, and break its inexplicable will to follow. He veered redemption away from the flat plains and into the labyrinthine heart of the rock formations, a jagged maze of narrow passes and steep, treacherous inclines. This was a test, a cruel one. The path was a nightmare of sharp stones and loose scree, difficult even for a powerful, sure-footed stallion like Redemption. For a foal, it was nearly impossible. Cole pushed onward, his face a mask of grim determination, refusing to look back. He told himself it was for the best. The foal would quickly realize it couldn't keep up. It would turn back, find an easier path, and their strange, unwanted journey together would be over. But every time he risked a quick glance, it was still there. He would see it scrambling desperately up a rock face, its small body trembling with effort. He would hear the painful clatter of its hooves as it slipped, recovered, and continued onward. Its persistence was no longer just annoying. It was baffling. It was unnatural. The tiny creature was pushing itself past the brink of exhaustion, its sides heaving, its head drooping low. Yet, it never stopped. It was as if the foal was being pulled forward by an invisible rope, a rope tied to something it saw in the stoic, retreating figure of the cowboy. Hours passed. The sun began to dip, painting the red rocks in fiery colors. Cole had led them on a punishing, circular route that ended not far from where they had started. He had gained no ground, but he had exhausted his pursuer. As he finally stopped to make camp in the shadow of a tall hoodoo, he watched the foal stumble to a halt 100 yards away. It didn't even have the strength to graze. It simply stood, its legs trembling, its gaze still locked on him. Cole felt a bitter taste in his mouth. He had won his cruel test, but it felt like a profound defeat. As darkness fell, the weather turned. The oppressive heat was chased away by a sudden, violent wind. Dark, bruised-looking clouds boiled over the horizon, and the air grew thick with the smell of rain and ozone. A storm was coming. Not a gentle prairie shower, but a brutal badlands squall. Cole worked quickly, securing his supplies and setting up a small, sturdy lean-to against the rock formation. Using his heavy oilskin tarp, it wasn't much, but it would keep the worst of the wind and rain off him and his saddle. The first drops of icy rain began to fall just as he finished. He crawled under the shelter, the wind howling outside like a hungry wolf. He thought of the foal, out there, alone, with no shelter from the storm's fury. A pang of something sharp and uncomfortable shot through him. He pushed it down. "It's not my problem," he told himself. "The wild is cruel. That is its way." He closed his eyes, trying to will himself to sleep. The sound of the rain turning into a relentless drumming on the tarp. But sleep would not come. With every gust of wind that rattled his shelter, he pictured the tiny creature, shivering and alone in the dark. He saw again its desperate scramble over the rocks, its unwavering, trusting eyes. He remembered the promise he had made to another dying animal, a promise he had failed to keep. The silence in his head, which he had craved just hours before, was now filled with a shouting accusation. His pragmatism was at war with his conscience, and his conscience was winning. With a curse that was lost in a clap of thunder, he threw off his blanket. He couldn't do it. He couldn't be the man who listened to a creature freeze to death just a stone's throw away. Pulling on his coat, he grabbed a spare blanket and stepped out into the raging storm. He found the foal huddled miserably at the base of a small, windswept bush, soaked to the bone and shivering uncontrollably. It looked up at him, its eyes wide with fear, too weak to even run. Cole didn't speak. He simply draped the thick wool blanket over the foal's back, a gesture of truce. Then, he gently, but firmly, nudged the small creature, guiding it back towards the lean-to. The foal, after a moment's hesitation, followed him into the small, dry space. It huddled at the far end, still wary, but the violent shivering began to subside. Cole returned to his bedroll, the uncomfortable feeling in his chest replaced by a quiet, strange sense of peace. For the first time on this journey, they were not pursuer and pursued. They were two lonely souls, sharing a small patch of dry ground in the heart of a storm. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving the Badlands washed clean and glittering under the first rays of the rising Sunday. A profound stillness had settled over the landscape, a silence that felt less like emptiness and more like peace. Cole awoke to find the foal still huddled under the lean-to, wrapped in the now damp blanket. It was asleep, its breathing deep and steady. For the first time, it looked not like a problem, but simply like a child, exhausted and at rest. Cole moved quietly, rekindling the embers of his fire to brew a pot of coffee. He expected the foal to bolt the moment he stirred, to retreat back to its customary, safe distance. But as the scent of coffee began to fill the cool morning air, the foal awoke, stretched its stiff, young muscles, and did something that caught Cole completely by surprise. It did not run. It did not retreat. Instead, it took a few hesitant steps out from under the shelter and walked directly towards him. It stopped just a foot away, its large, dark eyes looking up at him not with fear, but with a clear, inquisitive trust. Redemption, who had been standing nearby, let out a low, soft nicker as if in encouragement. Cole remained perfectly still, his hand frozen halfway to his coffee cup. He watched as the foal lowered its head, and then he felt it, a soft, wet, tentative nudge against his outstretched hand. It was the first time it had initiated contact. It was not a plea for food or a demand for attention. It was a simple, profound gesture of gratitude. A thank you. A strange, unfamiliar warmth spread through Cole's chest, thawing a place that had been frozen for a very long time. The pragmatic, hardened cowboy who had cursed this creature just yesterday seemed to vanish, replaced by the man who had once sat with a dying horse, the man who understood the language of silent suffering. He looked down at the foal, truly looked at it. For the first time, he saw the burrs matted in its scruffy coat, the raw, scraped patches on its knees from the desperate climb the day before. He saw the profound exhaustion in the slump of its shoulders, and the deep, gnawing hunger that made its small frame seem so fragile. This wasn't a nuisance. This was a survivor, an orphan fighting for its life with a courage that shamed his own frustration. Slowly, carefully, he stood up and went to his saddlebags. He pulled out a small, withered apple he had been saving for himself and a spare tin cup. He poured a small amount of his own precious water into the cup, a gesture that, just a day ago, would have been unthinkable. He placed the cup and the apple on the ground in front of the foal. The foal drank the water thirstily, its small body shuddering with relief. It then nudged the apple, unsure of what to do with the strange, round object. Cole knelt, his movements slow and gentle. He picked up the apple, pulled a knife from his belt, and cut a small, manageable slice, placing it on his open palm. He held it out. "Go on, it's okay." The foal hesitated for only a moment before taking the slice of apple from his hand, its soft lips brushing against his callous skin. As he watched the small creature eat, Cole made a decision. His shortcut could wait. His destination no longer seemed as important as the small, breathing responsibility that now stood before him. He would not leave it behind. He would see it to safety, to the next town, the next ranch, wherever that might be. He didn't know it yet, but this simple act of shared water and food was not just a turning point. It was an acceptance of a quest he didn't even know he was on. The journey was different now. It was no longer a flight and a pursuit. It was a partnership, a strange, silent caravan of three, moving as one across the vast, empty plains. Cole no longer tried to outrun the foal. He set a pace that its short legs could comfortably manage. He shared his water freely and foraged for edible grasses for the small creature each evening. The foal, in turn, never strayed far. It trotted contentedly alongside Redemption's massive legs, finding a strange comfort in the shadow of the gentle giant. Cole's annoyance had been replaced by a quiet, protective affection. He found himself talking to the foal, much in the same way he talked to Redemption, his voice a low murmur against the constant whisper of the wind. He called it Scamp, a nod to its ragged appearance and its rascally persistence. For the first time in a long time, traveling alone, Cole didn't feel lonely. They traveled like this for 2 more days, a peaceful, unspoken rhythm settling between them. But the central question, the great mystery of the foal's origin, still lingered in the back of Cole's mind. There had been no sign of a wild herd, no trace of a mother searching for her lost child. It was as if the foal had simply appeared out of the dry earth itself. The answer came on the 5th day, in a moment as quiet and unexpected as the foal's first touch. Cole had stopped to rest the horses in the shade of a lone, weathered butte. As he was checking the foal's hooves for stones, his eyes fell upon a marking on its right flank. It was a patch of white fur, partially hidden by the dusty coat, in the distinct and unmistakable shape of a single, elegant feather. A jolt, electric and profound, shot through Cole. The feather. He had seen that mark before. His mind was thrown back weeks, to a time before he had entered the Badlands, when he was traveling through the rolling foothills that bordered them. He had been following a creek when he found her. A beautiful, wild paint mare. Her coat a stunning mix of brown and white. Her leg was horribly broken, caught in a sudden, cruel rock slide. She was dying. There was nothing he could do to save her. He was too far from any town, and the break was too severe. But he could not bring himself to simply ride away and leave her to the predators. So, he had stayed. He had sat with her all afternoon, his hand resting on her neck, speaking to her in a low, soothing voice, a quiet vigil for a life he could not save. He had stayed until her breathing had finally, peacefully, stopped. He remembered the profound sadness in her eyes, but he also remembered her strength, her quiet dignity in the face of death. And he remembered, with a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity, the unique white patch on her flank. It was shaped exactly like a feather. Before he had left her, he had noticed that her udders were full. She was a new mother. He had scanned the horizon, searching for a foal, but saw nothing. He had assumed it had already been taken by coyotes, another small tragedy swallowed by the unforgiving wilderness. As he stood to leave, he had placed a hand on the dead mare's brow and made a quiet, foolish promise to the empty air. "I'll look for your little one," he had whispered. A promise he knew he could likely never keep. He had forgotten it almost as soon as he had ridden away. But the foal hadn't forgotten. The terrible, beautiful, impossible truth crashed down on Cole with the force of a physical blow. He stumbled back, his eyes wide with disbelief, staring at the small, scruffy creature before him. This wasn't a random orphan. This wasn't a coincidence. This was the foal, her foal. It hadn't been following him by chance, driven by some primal, unexplainable instinct, by the faint, lingering scent of its mother on his clothes and his hands. It had been tracking him for days, across miles of brutal, unforgiving terrain. It had been following the last living creature to show its mother kindness. It had been searching not just for a savior, but for the fulfillment of a promise its mother had somehow understood, a promise whispered by a stranger in the hour of her death. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The wind, the sun, the vast, empty plains, it all faded away. All Cole could see was the small, dusty foal with the feather-shaped mark, and the ghost of its mother, her gentle, dying eyes reflected in her child's, the Baron's. He saw the whole, impossible story laid bare. The mare's lonely death, the foal's terrified flight, and the desperate, instinct-driven search for the one scent in the wilderness that meant safety. He thought of his own harshness over the past days, his frustration, his anger, the cruel test in the rocky maze, the long, cold hours he had left it to shiver in the storm. He hadn't been shunning a nuisance. He had been rejecting a sacred duty, unknowingly betraying a promise made to the dead. The guilt was a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs, buckling his knees. This was his all-in moment. It was not a choice he made, but a force that overwhelmed him. The stoic walls he had built around his heart, the pragmatic defenses of a man who had seen too much loss, crumbled into dust. He slowly, shakily, lowered himself to the ground, dropping to his knees in the dry, cracked earth. He was no longer the legendary cowboy, the stoic hero. He was just a man, humbled and broken by the sheer, impossible courage of the tiny creature that stood before him. The foal, sensing the monumental shift in the man's demeanor, took a hesitant step forward. It was no longer a follower pleading for attention. It was a child who had finally, against all odds, found what it had been searching for. It walked right up to the kneeling man, its quest complete. Cole looked up at the foal, his vision blurred. He saw the feather mark, and through it, he saw the face of the dying mare. He heard the echo of his own voice making a promise he never thought he'd have to keep. He saw the lonely, terrifying journey this small creature had endured, driven by a faith so pure and powerful it defied all logic. It had trusted him, even when he had been unworthy of that trust. The final wall inside him broke. The grief for his long-lost brother, the pain from a lifetime of scars, the profound sorrow for the dead mare, and the overwhelming awe for the foal's journey, it all came pouring out. He reached out, his hands trembling, and pulled the foal into a gentle, desperate embrace. And for the first time, since he was a boy, Cole Younger buried his face in the dusty coat of a horse and burst into tears. He wept. He wept with a raw, shuddering intensity that shook his entire body. They were not tears of sadness alone. They were tears of guilt, of relief, of profound, humbling gratitude. He wept for the mother who had died alone, for the child who had walked through hell to find him, and for the beautiful, terrible, unbreakable bonds that tied all living things together. The foal stood perfectly still, accepting the embrace, its small body a warm, living anchor in the storm of the man's emotion. In the vast, silent cathedral of the Badlands, a broken promise was finally healed. They did not go on to the next town. They turned around and made the long journey home. When Sarah saw Cole arrive, not with supplies but with a scruffy, exhausted foal in tow, she did not ask for an explanation. She simply saw the look in her husband's eyes and understood. The epilogue to this chapter of their lives was written in the green grass of their sanctuary. The foal, no longer scruffy or afraid, grew strong and confident. Cole gave him a name that was not just a label, but a definition of his existence. He called him Promise. A man's word is a sacred thing, but sometimes the promises we whisper to the wind, to the ghosts of the fallen, are the ones that truly define us. For in keeping his forgotten promise, Cole Younger hadn't just saved an orphan foal, he had saved a piece of his own soul. A promise is a powerful thing. If this story of a promise fulfilled moved you, click the video on your screen for another unforgettable tale from the Legends of Redemption. Don't forget to subscribe and tell us in the comments about a promise that changed your life.